We are headed for a constitutional crisis.
Legal experts warning of an impending constitutional crisis.
Some Democrats and legal experts say it leaves us smack dab in the middle of what they're calling a constitutional crisis.
If he intends to ignore what the courts say, this country will potentially find ourselves in a constitutional crisis.
So if the president, if the vice president, if others in the administration say we're just not going to listen to what the judicial branch says, that is a constitutional crisis. That is a crisis for our democracy. This is how democracies crumble and how dictators win in the end.
The most serious constitutional crisis, arguably of the last 100 years.
There's some debates unfolding right now about what exactly would qualify as a constitutional crisis. Are we in one? Seems to me we've been one for a long time. Certainly since the aftermath of 2020 election.
Constitutional law experts say this is the clearest sign that we might be creeping towards a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I think most Democrats believe it's a constitutional crisis.
Basically, we're in a constitutional crisis, even though there isn't a complete, clear definition.
It's a constitutional crisis. We are seeing an executive branch that has decided that they are no longer going to abide by the Constitution.
It is threatening the Constitution itself, hence a constitutional crisis.
A lot of critics of this White House suggest that they are on the cusp of a constitutional crisis.
Democrats have looked at this and see a potential constitutional crisis on the horizon.
We are at a point where we are basically on the cusp of a constitutional crisis, seeing this administration taking steps that are so clearly illegal.
We've got what experts are calling a real constitutional crisis.
The constitutional crisis, I believe we are in one.
The constitutional crisis here is that Congress has been subverted.
A constitutional crisis, grossly unconstitutional.
Yeah, listen, I think this is the most serious constitutional crisis the country has faced.
Do you think we're heading towards a constitutional crisis right now?
Yeah, I do believe that.
All of this is a constitutional crisis. We're watching this unfold over time. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic about this or to be on 11 all of the time, but is a constitutional crisis.
New warnings of a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, listen, this isn't hyperbole to say that we are staring the death of democracy in the eyes right now.
We are hearing the phrase constitutional crisis. Will the president drive the nation full steam ahead into a constitutional crisis? There have been so many unconstitutional and illegal actions in the first 18 days of the Trump presidency. We've never seen anything like this. Democrats to keep calling it a crisis, a constitutional crisis.
You really do have a constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
The constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
The constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis.
That is a genuine constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Maybe headed for a constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Is this a constitutional crisis?